Unless you've been living off the grid, you've probably been swept up by the massive wave of true crime programming that has hit our favorite streaming and podcast networks. In 2020 alone, we saw true crime hits like The Vow, Dirty John, and even Tiger King, which kind of defies all labels. So why are true crime stories filling up our feeds more than ever? Better question, why are we so obsessed with unsolved murders and the dark secret lives of real people? And what does that say about us? A lot goes into the evolution of this fascinating form of nonfiction storytelling, but one little podcast in particular helped boost true crime in the zeitgeist of American pop culture. This is 2014's Serial. Journalist and This American Life radio show producer Sarah Koenig set out to investigate a 15-year-old murder case of an 18-year-old girl, Hae Min Lee, in Baltimore. And instead of dedicating one This American Life episode to this story, she decided to break it up into one serialized episode per week for 12 weeks. This was not the first weekly podcast, but it helped pave the way for a ton of true crime and investigative podcasts to follow. That's because Serial's popularity spread like wildfire. Within a few months of premiering, it had been downloaded 68 million times. Sarah and her producers meticulously traced the events leading up to and following the girl's death. And what made the podcast particularly special was Sarah's long conversations with Hae Min's convicted killer, Adnan Syed. Adnan was a charismatic, friendly guy who, 15 years later, denied having anything to do with the death of his former high school sweetheart, even though a jury believed otherwise and sentenced him to life in prison at 19 years old. The podcast was especially nostalgic to the older millennial audience who were reminded of what high school was like in the 1990s. At its core, Serial was, as Sarah said herself, about the basics: love and death and justice and truth. And it was those things that pulled the audience in, inviting them to decide what really happened the day Hae Min Lee went missing and who might have really killed her. Serial inspired many hours of theorizing, countless articles, social media posts, and a 4-part HBO documentary exploring more of the case and the role the podcast played in reopening it. Not to mention, it won a Peabody Award, continued on for 2 more seasons, and opened up a huge new audience to podcasting. Before Serial, there was another major influential true crime documentary, HBO's 1996 film Paradise Lost: The Child Murders of Robin Hood Hills, which tells the story of the West Memphis Three, a group of teenage boys who were charged and convicted of mutilating and murdering 3 little boys in rural Arkansas. A Paradise and Adolescence Lost to Satanic Panic. What made the film so remarkable at the time was that filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had originally set out with the assumption the teens were guilty of the murders. But as the trial and filming began, they realized they had a much bigger story on their hands. And through their use of trial and police interrogation footage, first-person interviews, and reactions from the victims and the accused families, the filmmakers allowed the audience to make up its own mind. Were these misfit teens who listened to Metallica and read Stephen King books really disaffected, sadistic Satanists, or just scapegoats coerced by the police of a conservative Christian town? Our filmmaking philosophy was to treat the audience like a jury. You can come to your own conclusion. It's a much more powerful and persuasive experience. It was such a powerful experience, it became the most watched documentary on HBO at the time, and inspired 2 sequel documentaries about the West Memphis Three, with the final film, Paradise Lost: Purgatory, following the trio's release from prison in 2011 due to a plea bargain based on new DNA evidence. Purgatory was also nominated for an Oscar and Emmy that year, and multiple documentaries and adaptations followed after that. Paradise Lost would ripple through storytelling and pop culture for decades. It was the first film Metallica ever lent its music to, and it went on to inspire hit docuseries like Making a Murderer and scripted shows like The Night Of and When They See Us. In 2016, Hollywood fully embraced the true crime boom and produced a bunch of award-winning projects based on some of the darkest cases of the 1990s. The O.J. Simpson trial was one of the most memorable events of the decade, and ESPN's O.J. Made in America won an Oscar in 2017 for Best Documentary, and the scripted series American Crime Story: The People vs. O.J. Simpson won 9 Emmys in the same year. What was it about this story that hooked viewers over 20 years after the 1995 trial? Well, nostalgia for one. Though that might sound insensitive, considering the brutality of the crimes, but people, if they were alive and old enough, remember where they were the day the verdict was announced. It was was a pivotal moment in modern history, where true crime, Hollywood, and the sports world all collided into one sensational and super long trial that captured the attention of the entire world. Reliving that moment in time by binge-watching either or both the documentary and the Ryan Murphy-produced series transported the audience back to the mid-90s. It was a time when Americans followed these heavily televised events, including the trial of the young Menendez brothers who were found guilty of murdering their wealthy parents in Beverly Hills, and the violent shootout and FBI raid of a religious sect in Waco, Texas, both which were made into a TV series in 2017 and 2018. And Hollywood also hopped aboard the 90s true crime train with the Oscar-nominated 2017 film I, Tonya, starring Margot Robbie as disgraced figure skater Tonya Harding, whose ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly, orchestrated an attack on her skating rival, Nancy Kerrigan, right before the 1994 Olympics. Jeff, who only served 6 months of a 2-year prison sentence for racketeering, is played by actor Sebastian Stan. Allison Janney won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Tonya's abusive mother, and the film swept through the 2018 awards season. But what might be the most influential factor behind the current true crime boom? Women. Yep, the female audience is both producing and consuming this genre of storytelling more than ever before. One popular podcast called Wine and Crime reported back in 2018 that out of the over 500,000 downloads they get a month, 85% of them are by women. Another popular podcast, also hosted by women, My Favorite Murder, hit the #1 spot on iTunes within 5 months of their initial premiere in 2016. In fact, the vast majority of true crime podcasts are hosted by women. So why are women so into these disturbing stories? Well, some psychology experts, like Amanda Vickery at Illinois Wesleyan University, believe that women of all ages are particularly into the genre because it helps them understand how a crime is perpetuated. And while taking in these stories of crime and violence, women are subconsciously absorbing ways to cope with terrifying situations and figuring out signs of potential danger. Basically, with this theory, the more they understand how criminals think and act, the better women can protect themselves. Psychotherapist Rhea Gandhi explains in a February 2020 interview with Vogue magazine that women are often the victims and survivors rather than perpetrators. That sense of justice we feel at the end of a true crime film or series reflects our desire to be a part of social and legal systems that work tirelessly towards women's safety and protection. Whatever our reason may be for binging hours of the horrifying 2017 docuseries The Keepers about the murder and cover-up of a young nun, or the recent HBO docuseries I'll Be Gone in the Dark about the late writer Michelle McNamara's investigation into the Golden State Killer who is now serving 12 life sentences for murder, one thing is clear: the female audience stands true crime hard. At the end of the day, whether it's a desire for justice, a morbid fascination with the criminal mind, or just an escape enjoyed from the safety of one's couch, the explosion of true crime content proves that there is a huge audience out there anxiously awaiting for more.